So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. This is part 3 of the seemingly interminable response to Dr. Walter Veith's appearance on the Seventh-day Adventist show LED Live, hosted by Scotty, Keith, and the only one with more than one brain cell, Kendi. In the last episode, Kendi asked Veith where all the fossils of antediluvian humans were. His answer involved taking seriously Carl Baugh's claim about out-of-place artifacts and the Grand Canyon, none of which is actually something that answers Kendi's question. Now he's going to talk about the canyons of the sea. Let's see how dumb that is.
But the greatest canyons in the world are not on land. They're under the ocean.
That's right.
Trenches and canyons aren't the same thing.
Canyons that are
Unexplored.
vastly superior to what you find.
Since superior literally means higher, I'd say that they are inferior because of how low they are. But that's just a silly etymology joke.
So, you have the theory of Atlantis.
The theory of Atlantis, huh? I'm sure Disney will be happy to know that one of their worst-performing animated movies is now a theory. Atlantis comes from exactly one place, the writings of Plato, where he puts the story into the mouth of Socrates as a parable about hubris. All other takes on Atlantis are derivative of that one piece of fiction by Plato. There is no evidence for Atlantis. It suggests no new areas of research that have ever turned up anything. It does not successfully explain any data. Calling Atlantis a theory is an insult to both Plato and to science, and further, virtually all modern ideas about the actual existence of Atlantis trace back to, the Nazis. So let's not spread Nazi fantasies.
Mm-hmm. And the lost civilizations. What if humanity largely congregated and were destroyed, and most of those fossils are under the ocean?
Then we'd still find them, because fossils are pulled out of the ocean. And also, we have oceanic fossils on land today, so there are two methods for us to find fossils of antediluvian man, yet still, we don't.
Yeah, deep below where you could probably easily get to them.
Weird how that seems not to apply to other marine fossils. Remember last time I said that his answer to Kendi's question about the missing human fossils would involve special pleading? I guess that was a successful prediction. I've now done more science in this video series than Walter has in becoming a Seventh-day Adventist.
Correct. And then there would be a lot of trapped organic material down there. Mm-hmm. You know what? Yeah. Maybe we're driving with them today.
Yeah, except that we know how oil forms and is primarily from plant matter and not from ocean plants either. So that doesn't solve the problem in the least.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Because a lot of the oil fields, of course, the great ones are under the ocean. Now, what if vast categories of creatures? Now, there where you had rural areas or where populations were not largely distributed.
Or they were just along upland rivers. A place humans also like to settle and that can't be accounted for with this oil is people idea.
You would find the other animals like you would today. So those fossils we can find on land.
So more special pleading. Got it. Hey, here's an idea for why we can't find antediluvian humans. There never was a deluge, so nothing came before it.
But when we find them, they are also all in watery graves.
Hey look, a bunch of American rhinos in subaerial ash in Ashfall Beds, Nebraska. Oh, and what's this? The fighting dinosaurs from the Jadochta Formation in Mongolia? Sorry, Mongolians, if I murder that. Why, that's Aeolian sandstone. Neither of these are things formed by water. How odd that Walter would simply lie about these. And of course he's ignoring that water isn't synonymous with flood water, and that many of the water-deposited fossiliferous layers of rock on Earth physically cannot be deposited by a flood, including all the organic limestone.
Now, we always say in the evolution theory that they were in riverbeds.
First, that's going to be geology and taphonomy that will tell you that. And second, that's because geologists know how rivers deposit rock and recognize it when they see it. I'm sure Walt is just waiting to publish his paper about how all geologists are wrong about rivers, and he's actually the real genius. I won't hold my breath for the publication, though.
And that flash floods sort of buried these creatures, or they were ponds and the creatures came to drink, got stuck in the mud, etc.
Those are very different and distinguishable scenarios. When scientists say things like this, they're not just guessing. They can look and see that the sediment is consistent with soft, fine-grained mud that could trap an animal. Or if there are things like graded conglomerate that might indicate a flash flood. They're not just tossing darts at a dartboard labeled with things that can move sediment and just going with whatever they hit first.
That doesn't happen today. You don't get fossilization because scavengers eat them up, bacterial rotting takes place. There's no fossilization of that nature.
That's actually a really good point.
That would be a good point, if it were true, but it's not. Look up something called subfossils, and you will find that they are the remains of organisms that are undergoing a fossilization process. And to be doing that today means that there are fossils forming today. If fossils weren't forming, we wouldn't have things that are in the process of becoming fossils. We do, therefore fossils are forming today.
Yeah, the only thing
that's a good point that I've never really even kind of considered that before.
That's because it's not true, but once again, Scotty is willing to swallow anything Veith tosses at him because Scotty has no critical thinking and seems to be entirely governed by confirmation bias.
Like we don't see that happening right now.
No, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it does. In bogs, on beaches, in sedimentary basins. It's happening all the time. It's famously happening all the time at Lake Natron, so named for the salt that it's full of that both kills and preserves animals.
But you find rapid burial of anything from a dinosaur to whales.
Actually, the best fossils tend to result from relatively slow burial.
And the interesting thing is they're often stream-orientated. So you find these creatures lying in a particular direction. Now, that is only possible if it's catastrophic.
I've heard this claim before, but only from creationists, and I've never seen a source for it. If any of you watching know where creationists get this talking point from, please let me know. Really, most fossils are a jumbled mess with no clear facing.
Now, 99% of all fossils are in mud beds.
I guess if you have a wide enough definition for mud, that's probably true.
So in other words, they are water depositions. And if you still have orientation, then that is catastrophism.
But near as I can tell, we don't, and Walter hasn't offered anything to make anyone believe him. In fact, given how much he's lied, we all have very good reason to suspect anything he says may be untrue.
But it wasn't universal, they will say. Because as soon as you have a universal destruction, evolution ends.
That's right.
I mean, only if everything goes extinct, which I don't think is a likely outcome of a global flood. Any survivors will continue to evolve.
Because you have to develop to the point of humanity.
Humanity isn't the goal of evolution.
If you wipe everything out, then you would have to start the evolution process all over again, right?
No. If literally everything is gone, then sure, evolution probably ends. As extinction is the end of evolution for a lineage. But if that's not the case, then those organisms that survive don't undo the evolution they've gone through up to that point. Further, he's talking like evolution is complete now with the arrival of humans. But that's not at all true. Humans are not the end goal of evolution, nor are they immune to evolution, nor does their existence stop evolution except in those lineages that they drive to extinction. None of this makes a bit of sense, so of course our hosts are just nodding along and making agreeable lowing noises.
Right, and you got humans quickly.
Science cannot allow a universal flood.
Sure it can, if there's evidence for it. The first geologists were going out to look for the signs of the Great Noachian Deluge. They wanted to find it. They failed, and they kept failing, and eventually they stopped trying. Nothing about a global flood is in principle unscientific. It's a hypothesis like any other. It's just that every time we test it, it gets falsified.
Listen to that breakdown in almost every level, which ties back to evolution.
Yeah, so you only had local floods.
Local floods are the floods for which compelling evidence has been provided. If Walt wants to publish his compelling evidence for a global flood, he's welcome to. In fact, anyone is. The reason they don't is because they have no compelling evidence. Instead, they have lies that would be recognized by the average college sophomore in geology, and that's me being generous to the flood geologists. Most of their points wouldn't make it past a group of high schoolers in earth science class.
Now, most of the fossils, as I say, are of that nature, are watery demises.
Well, most of them are found in waterborne sediment, but that doesn't actually mean they died in the water. Things can fall into the water and be buried post-mortem.
You get a couple that are, let's say, buried in volcanic ash.
By a couple, he means hundreds. And when that ash is subaerial, it precludes a flood as the cause for the fossils, or it having happened during the same time when the volcano was erupting.
But then you have mainly molds of whatever there was before.
It's fun how, once again, I get to show ashfall beds in Nebraska, because that totally annihilates that idea. We do find some things preserved as voids in ash. That's how the people of Pompeii were preserved. The 3D figures of them you see in museums were actually created by filling in the voids, then clearing the ash.
You will find that at Vesuvius, for example. You'll find even humans burnt away, so only the casing remains of whatever there was.
Yes, but that's because those people died in pyroclastic flows, not subaerial ash. Those aren't the same thing, and actual fossils in pyroclastic flows are basically unheard of, because over geological time it's very unlikely that a void in a rock will last long as the rock comes under increasing pressure. Bones, on the other hand, are largely incompressible, and so they can survive much higher pressures, the kind of pressure that exists under the ground.
Or you'd have them in peat or in oil or in something like that where they are buried. You find those in peat bogs, for example.
That is formed by water. That is not a contrast to water burial.
Those are probably post-flood fossilizations.
But happened quickly.
Right, because earlier he said we don't have fossils forming today. Except that now he says we do. Fun times. The guy can't even keep his own lies straight.
So that's the kind of humanity that you would find. You would find something here, you'd find something there, but you wouldn't find the masses that you would expect.
Yeah, fossilization has never been very prevalent. It's a rare phenomenon that doesn't happen to most organisms.
But they're probably under the ocean.
I'm willing to grant that, but we don't find anything. And all Walter has pointed to are hoaxes and misinterpretations.
And that's why you have mythologies like Atlantis.
How in the ever-loving does that follow? Remember, Atlantis goes back literally to just one parable in Plato. It's not a widespread motif or ancient mythology, and there is literally no evidence that people took it seriously as a real event in the times of Plato. Also, weird how we don't see any creationists pulling up human fossils in the Mesozoic offshore deposits, even though we can and do pull up dinosaurs from such depths. Famously, Plateosaurus bones were pulled up by oil rig workers doing an exploratory drill in the North Sea.
Wow.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And the demonic world, they understand and know what happened.
Oh, they sure do.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood, burned by the embers of Armageddon, his soul blistered by the fires of hell, and tainted beyond ascension. He chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred, he found no peace, and with boiling blood, he scoured the umbral plains, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him.
And they're taking those stories of like, there's something under there. And if we tell enough stories, like they're probably paying attention to prophecy going, hey, this is a really great way to make people believe some truth over here.
How the f*** did we go from the already level 10 absurd idea that the flood is the real source for Atlantis to also now there's a demonic conspiracy? To do what? Misdirect ocean exploration? Trick people into thinking Atlantis is real? I don't even know. This is right up there with the satanic conspiracy to hide giraffes proposed by Job Martin.
And so if we start talking about it over here, then somebody finds something over here, it's going to believe it.
What the hell is Scotty even talking about? Is he okay? Can someone please call in a wellness check for this guy? I'm not sure he should be allowed to govern his own affairs.
And the idea is always, it was primitive then and it has to be advanced now. These people were stupid and we're brilliant.
Yeah.
No, technological advancement has gone back and forth, although the overall trend has been towards more technological advancement through the history of humanity. But two things are also true. That humans in the developed world are objectively and unarguably the most technologically advanced humans that have ever been, and that in no way makes modern humans more intelligent than humans 10,000 years ago. Imagine if you had all your memories wiped and replaced with some very basic survival skills. Basically, you're amnesiac Bear Grylls. But you're also someplace where drinking your own urine is only an option, rather than a necessity. And we'll say that you have a collection of some 50 or so other humans, some male, some female, all with the same amnesia. How far do you think you could advance science and technology on your own with those people in the wilderness during your lifetime? Remember, you don't know what the scientific method is. You don't know any of the stuff you learned in school. You can't write. And on top of that, you need to survive. Chances are you probably wouldn't make too many innovations. But that doesn't mean you're stupid. Similarly, we look at famous geniuses like Einstein or Leonardo or Avicenna as amazing minds. But how many similar geniuses toiled away in mines or on farms or died in a trench during a war, simply never having had the opportunity to leave a mark on the world commensurate with their intellectual ability? The modern heights of technology are there because people have the opportunity to innovate and the ability to pass down knowledge so that we don't have to start anew every generation. It is not an indication of higher intelligence now than in the past.
Yeah, but that's not it. Yeah.
If you go into the archaeological world, how did they transport or even cut those huge pillars out of the ground?
That were as hard as stone.
First, I love that Scotty has to remind us that stone pillars are as hard as stone. Thanks, buddy. Anyway, how were pillars cut out of stone? Well, we have archaeological evidence of how people in ancient times worked stone. The stone for the pillars was quarried as large box shapes, and the process was fairly straightforward. First, a part of a quarry was identified as likely not to have cracks that would ruin the size of the block needed. Then the block was likely outlined with charcoal or chalk or something. Then quarrymen started roughly cutting the block out of the quarry. What tools they used for this varied, but included things like pounding stones and chisels made of copper, bronze, and iron. Eventually, all that would be left connecting the stone block to the quarry would be a thin bit of rock, which would be generally snapped with a lever or levers of some kind, whether wood or metal later. That's how big stones were extracted from quarries. The finishing wasn't done in situ at the quarry, but on site under the supervision of experts who had access to tools like compasses, plumb bobs, straight edges, saws, smaller chisels, and polishing stones. Pillars do not now and never have emerged perfectly formed from a quarry.
We can't do that today. You'd need specialized laser technology in order to do that.
Yes, we can. The fact that today we use fancier technology doesn't mean we couldn't do it the old-fashioned way. What is this argument? I have a coffee machine and a coffee grinder. To make coffee, I fill the reservoir with water, grab pre-roasted beans from a bag, grind them, put those in a filter, then flip a switch. I could grab some green coffee beans, roast them on a wood fire I built myself, then draw water from a well, crush my roasted beans in a mortar, then put them in my well water and boil that over my wood fire, then pour it into a mug using gravity filtration to minimize coffee grounds in my coffee. But I don't. Because why the hell would I? Similarly, the fact that modern rock quarries are quarried with fancy modern technology doesn't mean that we couldn't use ancient technology, but what would be the point?
We find artifacts that are hard to explain. We find hieroglyphics that are hard to explain.
Once again, I'm going to need to see a citation. I'm not even sure what it means for a hieroglyphic to be hard to explain. We know what basically every hieroglyph is, and while a few are abstract, none of them are like computers or spaceships or something. At least no compelling case for any such glyphs has been put forth, to my knowledge.
And the technology might even have been far advanced to what we have today.
Like a printer?
I love that Scotty's idea of high tech that surpasses our own is a printer. What an absolute pea-brain.
Yes, all kinds of objects. They find cathode rays, they find all kinds of materials in the fossil record.
First, cathode rays can't be found in the fossil record because they're beams of electrons. They don't preserve. But if we give Walter a very undeserved benefit of the doubt and say he meant cathode ray tubes, well, we don't have any of those in the fossil record either. But also, that's not technology that surpasses our own. Cathode ray tubes were cutting edge more than a century ago. We've moved on a bit. Also, there are no printers in the fossil record, and if anyone wants to contest that, they're welcome to cite the fossil of a cathode ray tube or printer.
And also technologies that we have lost, that we are not capable of, that we are still wondering about.
Like Roman concrete? That's the only one that comes to mind, and Walter seems hesitant to give any concrete examples. This sounds like the ramblings of some guy who got high for the first time and started watching Graham Hancock.
And that's sort of hidden archaeology.
Yeah, I got a friend of mine that I love to talk about, random things in the world, and he's always talking to me about the even in the world wars, they were looking for Noah's tools.
Yes,
I always thought that was interesting.
So what, we get drunk, so what, we smoke weed.
You mentioned the Tower of Babel.
He sure did. I wonder if this will be any smarter than the nonsense coming from Bodie Hodge, formerly of Answers in Genesis.
And the Bible says God there confused the languages, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you just take language, for example, if language were evolutionary, then you would have a progression from simple sounds to complex language.
I mean, yeah, at some point, but Homo sapiens evolved like 300,000 years ago. And we don't even know that that was when language started. It could have started 1 million years ago with an even earlier species. And just like cathode rays, sound waves are really bad at preserving in rock.
But if you go through the history of languages,
which we really can't do much farther back than about 8,000 years if we're being generous, or less than 3% of the time just Walter's species has existed.
They're always far more structured and complex in the past than what they are today.
No, they're not. Let's look at, say, English. Old English had a more complex system of noun cases, but modern English has a much more complex verbal system with auxiliary verbs appending onto various other verb forms such as participles to form an almost absurdly complex system of tense and aspectual distinctions. African American vernacular English has taken this even farther, with at least one additional verbal mood generally lacking in standard American or British English. Modern Mandarin uses an extremely complex system of compounding lexical elements to overcome a relatively low syllable count, as well as using complex syntactic methods to allow words to perform different grammatical roles across multiple clauses. Finnish has so many noun cases that it's not even agreed how many there are. Swahili uses a large number of genders combined with gendered marking for verbal arguments to allow for free word order within a clause without needing noun cases. What about Latin, Babylonian, Ancient Chinese, or Sanskrit is measurably more complex than modern English, Swahili, or Mandarin? This is something people who know nothing about linguistics say. As a language evolves through time, parts of the language will indeed simplify, but other parts will complexify, and there is no clear way to measure either of these so that we can say how complex any language is compared to any other language, or whether a single language is becoming more or less complex diachronically.
Interesting.
We've actually had to simplify them because we've become dumbed down.
Who is this we? I certainly haven't simplified the language I speak. Notice also that so far, he hasn't actually told us how languages are simpler now than in the past. I mean, I could give examples of things about past forms of a language that are more complex in the past than now. For example, modern extemporaneous Arabic almost never uses case markers, whereas classical Arabic does use 3 case markers on nouns. English used to have a robust gender system for nouns much like other Germanic languages, and even most other Indo-European and even Afro-Asiatic languages. It no longer does. But as I already showed, I can also give instances in which modern languages are complex, often in ways their ancestral languages were not.
They were like goldfish.
Yeah. if you take Shakespeare, he had a vocabulary of 28,000 words.
A bunch of which he made up himself. But also, some guy having a big vocabulary within a language isn't a measurement of the language's complexity. It's a measure of that guy's knowledge of that language. So this is a category error.
Yeah.
And the average person today has about 5,000 words.
I'll just accept that. Shakespeare was a professional writer, so comparing his vocabulary to that of the average person today is not a fair comparison. We need to compare his vocabulary to a modern professional writer. But further, he's also just wrong. The sources I can find say that the average adult English speaker has a vocabulary of about 10,000 to 35,000, while the Oxford Dictionary has about 300,000 entries. In daily life, however, most speakers will only use a fraction of their total vocabulary. For example, I happen to know what the word fortuitous means, but it's not an everyday word for me. Similarly, I know what anti-disestablishmentarianism means, but it's not like I have a lot of conversations about the political position that the Church of England should stay the State Church of England. And of course, this is still a category error. The vocabulary of a single speaker is completely irrelevant to the complexity of a language, or even the total number of lexical items in that language.
Which we're probably exposed to more words just from your phone and
Correct.
all this.
And the cases that you used, the nominative, accusative, dative, and all of those, they were all incorporated in a very complex structure so that you could very precisely describe things.
Many languages still use those cases and more, so this is a bit Anglo-centric, but the cases that English used to have simply been replaced by other syntactic strategies. And English now is no less precise than English in the 9th century. For example, the sentence, Bita thon man se hund, is Old English for the dog bit the person. So is the sentence, thon man bita se hund, and also the sentence, se hund bita thon man. In Old English, who did what to whom was determined by case, which was most easily determined by the definite article. In this case, the word se means the, but also it indicates that the word that follows it is the subject of the clause. The word thona also means the, but tells us that the noun it is attached to is the direct object of the clause. In modern English, We don't mark general nouns for case, and instead, we use word order. The dog bit the man does not mean the same thing as the man bit the dog. Neither of these is more precise. It's simply two different strategies to mark who does what to whom. Further, English retains a genitive case. Anytime you put apostrophe S at the end of a noun in English, you're putting it in the genitive case, even if you're used to hearing it called the possessive or the possessive case.
Also in the different cases. Now, the King James Version still uses thee, thine.
Yeah, even English in 2024 still has cases for personal pronouns. That's why we have pronouns like she, her, hers, he, him, his. Those are nominative, accusative, and genitive respectively, although the accusative is also used for when Old English might use the separate dative case. Thee, thine, thy is just an explicitly singular second person, which contrasts with the plural ye, you, your, which is polite or plural. Also, modern English is in numerous dialects regaining an explicit number distinction in the second person, with words like y'all and yous.
Ye, your, you, for a very specific reason.
That specific reasoning being that that's how pronouns worked at an earlier stage in English.
Because without it, you would not be able to determine exactly who you are speaking to. Take, for example, Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, and he says, verily, verily, I say unto thee. That's singular. He's addressing Nicodemus. Ye, that's plural, must be born again.
So, the relevant passage here is John 3, 5-7, which I will read from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Quote, Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. What is born of flesh is flesh. What is born of the spirit is spirit. Do not be astonished that I say to you, you must be born from above. End quote. In the King James, it reads, quote, Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I say unto thee, ye must be born again. End quote. The underlying Greek does indeed switch to plural in verse 7. But also, let's think about this. Has anyone ever actually interpreted John 3:7 as Jesus telling just Nicodemus that he needs to be born again, but that it does not mean anyone else does? I very much doubt it. And if the translators of more recent versions had wanted to, they could have made the switch to plural explicit by just saying all of you instead of you. Because even though Standard English does not make a number distinction in second person personal pronouns, the language can still make the distinction when it is necessary. Similarly, if English needs to be explicit about a singular second person, you can use phrases like just you, only you, or you alone. See what I mean? You can't just simply look at something like how many distinct personal pronouns a language has, then declare that the smaller the number, the simpler the language. Nor does doing that mean that a language is more or less precise overall.
Wow.
If you take that out, you lose those connotations.
Only if you want them to be lost. English has strategies to disambiguate such things when necessary. It's just that it's not normally necessary. Really, think about it. How often in your life does the fact that you might refer to one person or more than one person actually cause confusion for you when you are reading, writing, speaking, or listening to English? For me, it's almost never, which is why English has been doing just fine without a number distinction in personal pronouns.
That just opens up your mind to go like, I appreciate the King James Version tons more just from that sentence.
The King James is based partially on out-of-date grammars of Greek and manuscripts that we know are late and full of various late additions. Modern translations of the Bible, using editions of the text that are based on a fuller knowledge of the manuscripts, are better. Further, much of the language of the King James was out of date even when it was published and is downright confusing to modern readers. Here's an example. In Genesis 1:28, God tells the humans he has created to replenish the earth. Similarly, in Genesis 9:1, God says that Noah and his sons should replenish the earth. So were the humans in Genesis 1 to go repopulate an earth that used to have humans but no longer did, like they were in 9:1? No, in the language of the King James, replenish simply means fill, not fill again. There is no bare verb plenish, meaning fill, and the modern use of the word with that meaning is by analogy with other words that have the prefix of re, meaning to do again. Indeed, in the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, the word is simply fill in both cases. And indeed, the underlying Hebrew verb is the same in both verses in the Masoretic text. So in addition to the King James including verses that were not originally part of the text, it also includes language that will give modern readers the wrong impression. The King James is an important part of the English literary tradition as well as the history of Christianity in English-speaking countries. but it is in fact a bad Bible for either devotional or scholarly work.
That wasn't in the common language at the time. They had simplified it to the simple you, which, by the way, is plural.
No, it was plural, but leaving the explicit number distinction was not a deliberate choice by the translation team of the King James Version. The King James is not a new translation starting from scratch. It is a revision of the earlier Bishop's Bible in which one of the mandates was to make as few changes as necessary. The King James uses thee, thou, and thy because the Bishop's Bible did.
Wow.
And is not singular, but is used in a singular fashion today.
If language is used in a particular way today, then that's what it means today. You is singular and plural in standard English now. Walt doesn't have to like it, he doesn't even have to agree, but it simply is. Words mean what people use them to mean. Indeed, even in that sentence, I just use the word people as the plural form of the word person. Originally, people was a word that meant about the same thing as ethnic group or nation. It was a singular word, and the plural form was not unusual, peoples. But in English today, it's the plural form of the word person. That's how English speakers use the word, so that's what the word means.
What I'm saying is language was far more structured and complex in the past than it is now.
Right.
And his sole example was that standard English doesn't have a plurality distinction in second-person personal pronouns, even though many varieties of English spoken today do. Yeah, if you think he's proven his case, let me know in the comments, but I have to say, it's going to take a whole lot more than pointing out one weird thing about English pronouns grammarians don't want you to know.
So is that evolution or is that devolution on the level of language?
Neither. It's just regular old language change, like has been going on for presumably hundreds of thousands of years.
Now we're just like, we take out all the vowels. Seriously.
It's like Scotty is trying to come off as dumb as possible. Typing SRSLY is not an attempt to remove the vowels from the word seriously. It is a written abbreviation. Fundamentally no different than writing Mr. MR period. I very much doubt that Scotty goes through his life alphabetically spelling out every single word. Common words get abbreviated. This has happened throughout history. In Old English, the word that was often written with a single special character. The ampersand symbol, which means and, was originally just a combination of the letters E and T together into a single glyph, because in Latin text the word et, meaning and, came up a lot. In biblical manuscripts and Christian art, words like Jesus, Christ, God, and Mother are often shortened to 2 or 3 letters with a bar over them to indicate it's an abbreviation. Scotty doesn't have to like abbreviating the word seriously by removing all but the last vowel character, but the vowels are still there when people speak. Let me know in the comments if you think Scotty knows that in Hebrew, the language of most of his favorite book is written in, most vowels are not written.
It's like we don't want to type out the thing. We're lazy.
Yeah, welcome to being human, Scotty. Like, is he new to the whole human thing? He looks like he's been doing it a while.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
That really is mind-blowing.
That English personal pronouns have changed? I mean, it's not the first time, and it's still happening. I'm not really sure what's amazing about that. All languages change over time, unless they're dead, and even then they sometimes do. Latin is a dead language that gets new words fairly frequently, because despite not having a community of first language speakers, it is still used in an official capacity at the Vatican City, and so needs ways to refer to modern concepts like motorcycles and the internet.
I was going to sit and chew on that for Yeah, right? Sit and chew on that for a second. I mean, just so much beautiful things that I think God has preserved in looking at the record of what's happened in the planet. I think that God had that forethought. Things are going to go wrong. People are going to have questions. Let's put them in the earth. You know what I mean? Let the earth cover it in a way that people will dig it up. And
then everyone who doesn't start with the conclusion that the primeval history of Genesis is literally true will come to the conclusion that all the evidence contradicts that possibility. If the geology and fossil record of Earth were created by God to communicate any message at all, it's that Genesis 1 through 11 simply did not happen in any recognizable way.
It should answer what happened back then.
It does, just not in the way that Scotty, Keith, Kendi, or Walter would like.
Otherwise, you just leave it to humans are going to reinterpret everything constantly. It'd be so confusing.
It's kind of like that's why there are so many Protestant denominations.
And so God had to make a way for us to look backwards and see the record and make decisions about what happened.
It must be very frustrating if you're trying to negate something in the Bible and then you dig it up in archaeology.
Yeah.
I guess that would be frustrating, but the history of archaeology is largely the opposite. People trying to confirm biblical stories and then finding out that the evidence is against their historicity. Now, that's not the case for all the stories of the Bible. Some have indeed had confirmation from archaeology, at least in their broad outline. But yeah, it's far more common for someone to go out into the field, Bible in hand, to show how historical the Bible is, and then fail entirely, than it is for someone to go out trying to prove the Bible wrong, but then finding evidence that it's true. Indeed, as far as I can tell, very few, if any, archaeologists are trying to discredit the Bible. They're trying to learn about the past through the material culture that the people of the past left behind. This persecution fetish is not reflected in reality.
Take the year 457 BC, the decree for Artaxerxes.
It's a decree from Artaxerxes, not for him. The decree was for Ezra.
To restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince. A very precise prophecy as to when the Messiah would be, inaugurated as the Messiah.
Neither Ezra 7 nor Zechariah 9 contain any dates about the Messiah. Zechariah 9 does have a prophecy about a ruler for God's people coming on a donkey foal, but the timing isn't mentioned. Instead, what's going on is that people in the 19th century were super into prophecy and numerology, and combined various bits of the Bible with references to the restoration of the temple, other random bits, and then massaged the numbers to make prophecies about the coming of Jesus. Of course, the telling thing is that no one before Jesus was able to make these predictions, because they only work if you know the answer in advance. If you have a goal in mind and you're willing to do a lot of work, you can make anything look like it predicts anything, as long as the source text is big enough. And of course, all the predictions about the future that were made using these techniques turned out to be wrong. If you want to know more about how Adventists get this bullshit, you should research the Great Disappointment. Seventh-day Adventists are an outgrowth of the Millerite movement that experienced their then prophets' utter failure at using math and the Bible to predict anything. If you want a more recent example, look at Harold Camping, who predicted that the world would end in 2011, leaving many of his followers to quit jobs and sell their homes, leaving them in ruin when it turned out that the world did not end. Using Bible codes and math has never worked because the math used to connect the events in the Bible was never in the Bible in the first place. And so even if the Bible were the infallible word of God, Adventists and their forebears are just making things up on the basis of wishful thinking. But if we don't assume that the Bible is the infallible word of God, then it's even worse. Then it's just people picking some random book and doing math on the basis of nothing to predict events that aren't going to happen anyway. Anytime someone tries to tell you that all this math they did proves that the Bible is true and that the end times are coming, they're wrong. They always have been wrong, they always will be wrong, and you believe them at your own peril. There is a reason most Christian groups don't bother with this nonsense.
And that date as a starting date is cast in stone because it stands on an archaeological find. So it's irrefutable. You cannot move it.
Archaeological dating is rarely precise to the calendar year, so in fact, it can be moved.
Well, that's why I think evolution is an important topic to discuss. I'm glad that you were, able to come on and talk about this topic because I think it's relevant to us today.
Yeah, generally speaking, science is relevant. Perhaps now more than ever. Evolution denial kills people. It causes famine and disease outbreaks that are entirely preventable. Rejecting science has real consequences, and they're not generally good ones either.
I think there's a lot of Christians that just, I don't need to know about that or whatever like that. I have had a very close friend of mine, and he raised his children totally Christian, and his son went to go into college, Christian his whole life, took one class, doesn't believe in God.
Maybe Scotty's friend shouldn't have tied Christianity to obvious lies like evolution being untrue. I know plenty of people who started and ended college Christian. Most of them didn't tie their faith to science denial, though.
And it's like, what you can derail somebody off of, literally a professor.
Or just a book. It turns out that when a key part of your faith is denying demonstrable reality, it's pretty easy to shake that faith.
Well, when I started lecturing on this issue, of course, I come into conflict with all my colleagues.
Translation. When he started lying to students because he thinks his daughter was possessed and then a plumber or something said Ellen G. White was super cool and not cringe. The professors who actually cared about educating rather than miseducating students didn't much care for that.
So the students would ask me in class, because whenever I spoke about these issues, I would say, according to the theory of evolution, this is how it works. And students are very observant, do you know that?
There sure are. Probably why so few of them make it to graduation while still being young Earth creationists.
they would stop me and say, excuse me, you're the only one who ever says that. All the others says this is how it happened. You say, according to the theory of evolution, this is how it happened. Why do you say that? Do you actually not believe it or what?
That's awesome.
Would you give us an answer to that question?
I'm skeptical if this is how it went down. I don't have a way to check, and I also don't super care. I'm going to skip his autobiographical stuff. I don't care how he interacted with his students or colleagues. Basically, Walter says that he had after-hour discussions, and then for some reason, Scotty ties that into thinking that the margarine ad campaign, I can't believe it's not butter, was actually people lying to consumers about something. It's not clear. He's a moron who's only barely more coherent than Ramat. But now, Walt's going to tell us what his students did after he spent some time lying to them at school.
And then they would come into the other people's classes, and the guy would say, or whoever it was, the lecturer, this and this and this, what happened? They say, excuse me, that's wrong.
Well, I guess I can see why his colleagues didn't like him. He was getting their students to regurgitate his lies in other classes, thereby disrupting those classes. He definitely should have been fired.
And that created major conflict.
Fireworks.
Wow! Telling students lies and then going on to disrupt numerous other classes wasn't a big hit? How shocking.
Fireworks.
You know, that could have been the coolest YouTube channel back then.
There are plenty of YouTube channels about young Earth creationism. I'm not sure what that would have added. Indeed, Walt is still welcome to start a YouTube channel. I certainly can't stop him.
If you just had a
Those
camera in that
discussions?
room.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Somebody needs to do that.
So he means someone needs to film themselves disrupting a class? Yeah, that's probably a really good way to get disciplined, and it might even be illegal. You can't just film anywhere, and a number of classes I took explicitly forbade video recording. If you're out there and you want to film what amounts to a higher education classroom prank video, you better do your homework on what the code of conduct says in your class, that professor's policies, and the laws in your jurisdiction. Of course, I'm not a lawyer or a representative of your school, so I'm not giving advice except, check.
That's so wise. That's how my pastor taught us students to take tests as we were preparing for college.
Yeah.
Because really, you got to get through it. There's certain classes you just have to take depending on your major. So when it comes to, you have this test, you know the information, you may not agree with the information. Use language. According to so-and-so, this is the answer. And just keep it pushing. Get your grade and, keep your stance firm in the Lord.
Once again, Kendi is the only one with more than one brain cell in the room. Yes, if you think the information you're getting in class and are expected to know is incorrect, feel free to answer test questions with according to or something like that. But don't disrupt class time. Most courses are fairly packed in terms of how much time there is versus how much material there is. Discussions about nonsense like flat Earth or young Earth or anti-evolution should be for after hours. Don't disrupt class like Scotty wants you to, and like Veith's students apparently did.
But Scotty, to your point about the student who just one class and it flipped them, there's 2 points I'd like to make. One, the reverse is also true.
Cool.
The reverse
Good
back
point.
to the Lord, instantaneous, or just finding truth and making the decision to stand for the right.
That sounds a whole lot like finding the belief that makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside and going with it. That's clearly what happened with Walter, and none of our hosts have shown enough understanding of, anything, to make me feel like they have based their beliefs on things like evidence. After this, Kendi says that it's part of the beauty of Christianity. Whatever, I don't care. Keith then jumps in to talk about a guy who he went to college with and who left Christianity.
Yeah, and his knowing who that is, his decision, my personal opinion is it's not based on the science.
To some degree, I agree with this. I don't think science and Christianity are in a strict dichotomy, even if some versions of Christianity are. But when you do what these guys are doing, equating Christianity with science denial, is it any wonder that people would abandon Christianity after learning science?
He based his decision on a relationship.
Well, now Scotty is just describing Walter, because remember, he abandoned his Christianity because of his relationship with his mother, rejoined the Catholic Church because of his relationship with his daughter, and then joined Seventh-day Adventism because of his relationship with, a contractor or something. It's not creationism without a healthy dose of projection.
And he's upset and he's angry, and so it's his way to get back at God and to get back at, his parent.
I think that's a lot of people's experience.
And say, I'm rejecting this because I'm rejecting you.
Well, a lot of people have faced abuse at the hands of a religious parent, and not too infrequently the religion is used to excuse the abuse. Proverbs 13:24 just explicitly endorses child abuse. If you want your kids to stay a part of your religion when you can't actually force them to, maybe don't abuse them and then blame your religion for the abuse.
it's not it's not about the information from Christianity. It's about rejecting the individual, like was in your case.
Look, maybe it was. Maybe that guy had no intellectual problems with the propositions of Seventh-day Adventism. But that doesn't actually change that such problems exist. And some people are going to leave because of them. Fundamentally, the Earth isn't flat, young, or surrounded by water. Evolution is real. These are things that are at odds with a literal reading of Genesis. So if you insist on a literal reading of Genesis 1 through 11, people have good reason to reject your ideas. Then it's Kendi saying that God will make things right in the end? Okay.
For every argument out there on the evolutionary level, there is a counter-argument which is equally as plausible.
Mm-hmm.
Weird then how none are ever presented. What is he, keeping them a secret? Is this like what really goes on in those Christian meetings after all the catechumens are dismissed? They go over the real reasons young Earth creationism is implausible that us plebs don't get to know about?
So if you actually put them on the table, and that's why you have so many creationists today, and
they're a declining portion of the population even in the former U.S., so I'm not sure what he's talking about.
There was an argument once about, who would become a creationist in this modern world. He would have to be insane.
No, just very misled, or someone who prioritizes emotion over evidence, like Walter. I don't think that's necessarily insane, but then again, it's not like I'm a psychologist, so what do I know? But okay, I'm done with this whole cope session about people not buying their bullshit. Let's cut back in after we get some more actual science-type claims.
God would never expect you to go against facts and knowledge.
Walter might, though. In fact, he manifestly does. And if God is such a fan of facts and knowledge, then why are so many of his fans so dishonest?
That is called irreducible complexity.
Ah, irreducible complexity. One of the most strongly falsified ideas in young Earth creationism. You see, irreducible complexity did the one thing you're not supposed to do in pseudoscience. Being a real, falsifiable hypothesis. Irreducible complexity is more or less a rehash of William Paley's watchmaker argument. For those of you who might not be familiar with this argument, it goes thusly. You are walking along a beach and encounter a pocket watch discarded in the sand. You pick it up and examine all the interconnecting gears and springs and hands. You realize that this must be the work of an intelligent agent, and that no amount of erosion, volcanism, etc. could bring such a well-ordered object into being. Of course, the problem is that watches can't do things like reproduce naturally with variations that can improve or reduce their chances of reproducing in the future. So they're not at all a good analogy for living things. Michael Behe is the Catholic responsible for the updated version known as irreducible complexity, which he put forth in his book Darwin's Black Box. In it, he says that a system can be considered irreducibly complex if it is composed of well-matched components such that the removal or absence of any component causes the system to stop functioning. He's unclear as to what constitutes a system, leaving it open that it could be something as small as a single protein or as large as the entire organism. Behe's hypothesis is that such systems cannot come about through evolution, and if such systems can be found in living things, then such systems could not have evolved, and thus evolution cannot explain all of modern biology. It should be noted, though, that this does not preclude any amount of common ancestry, and indeed in his book, Behe is open to common ancestry of all mammals being plausible, which means that while he is certainly an anti-evolutionist, in the broad sense, he allows for far more evolution than young Earth creationists would. The problem for Behe is that if it can be shown that any irreducibly complex system has evolved, then his hypothesis is simply wrong and irreducible complexity is no barrier to evolution. Such things have been shown with his favorite examples, the bacterial flagellum and the mammal blood clotting cascade, as well as with the VPU protein in HIV group 1. The last of those even evolved in historical times. It can also be argued that the evolution of aerobic citrate metabolism in E. coli in the Lenski long-term experiment is the evolution of a new irreducibly complex metabolic pathway that humans watched happen in real time in a lab. So no matter how irreducibly complex the bacterial flagellum is, it doesn't actually matter. It isn't an argument against evolution on the whole, and it was never an argument against irreducible complexity.
If you take the proton-driven motor of a flagellum.
Yeah, flagellum, that's right.
For
that's
example, the little driving appendage to unicellular organisms, right?
Wow, that was a mouthful.
Yeah.
That little structure,
falls apart.
That engine is irreducibly complex.
It sure is. Of course, we also know it evolved from a bacterial secretory system. We know how it evolved. It, on its own, defeats the whole point of irreducible complexity.
You cannot create it by incremental improvement. Mm-hmm. Everything has to be there.
Yes, for it to function as a little motor. But it can have other functions without all the parts. For example, it can secrete chemicals. In fact, modern bacteria still use a rudimentary version of the flagellum to inject other cells with toxins. The above-mentioned E. coli do that when they infect organisms.
It's like a motor. Mm-hmm. You can't leave the pistons out.
Yeah.
You can't leave the crankshaft out.
Mm-hmm.
You can't leave any of those components out and hope that it'll come together.
Yeah, it won't come together as a motor, but we happen to know that all the parts in the flagellum that are analogous to those parts of a motor also function for other purposes in other contexts.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be complete. Now, that motor is so complex. It has forward gears. It has reverse gears. It has low range. It has high range. It can create torque to overcome obstacles.
Oh, wow. Like a tractor.
It can accelerate. This motor, and it's so efficient, there's nothing that comes close to it.
It is impressive, but being impressive isn't an argument against evolution. Essentially, this is the same argument as big number, therefore God, or look at the trees. The fact that things are cool isn't evidence that science is wrong. It's not even clear what the argument is. It's not clear why cool or impressive things need God in order for them to be cool. Most people think that things like geysers and volcanoes are cool, but I don't think that they're miraculous. Why must organisms be miraculous if they're cool?
And it cannot evolve. It has to come about instantaneously in that configuration, or else it doesn't work.
Well, it can't evolve in the boring way of just slowly incrementally getting better at the function of propulsion, but that's not how it's proposed to have evolved. Instead, a more likely scenario is that the simpler Type 2 secretory system, which already uses rotational motion, in some cases started extruding a structural protein like modern flagellin, which then in one single step, possibly with just one mutation, allowed for limited mobility. After that point, the evolution of more complex gear-like elements and a more refined shape to the flagellin can indeed be reached incrementally.
It's called irreducible complexity.
You already said that, Grandpa.
And it's a major obstacle to the evolutionary theory.
So do they avoid it? Don't want to talk about it?
Well, in 2024, there were just over 6,000 papers that came up on a Google search for evolution of flagellum. So no, scientists aren't avoiding this. Now, because irreducible complexity is an already falsified idea, that itself is not subject to any real research, just like flat Earth isn't. But irreducibly complex systems are researched all the time, with papers being published in 2024 about just one such system at a rate of about 20 a day.
Well, they just add more time. It must have happened somehow, miraculously. Given enough time, it probably happened.
A mutation to change the binding affinity of a secretion complex isn't exactly a miracle. That's a pretty ordinary kind of thing. As for how long it would take, well, there's no way to predict how long it will take until a particular mutation takes place, or any way to really predict in advance how many mutations could have the desired effect. So there's not really a great way to know.
If you leave the diesel engine long enough, it will turn into an F-15.
Well, since diesel engines aren't living things that can reproduce themselves with mutations and differential reproductive success, this is just a bad analogy. In fact, while I don't think Scotty is using it in bad faith, I suspect that the idea of using vehicles as analogies for organisms in evolution may have been developed in bad faith. It's such a poor analogy, I have trouble thinking that it was first used in good faith, but I admit, I don't know who first used it or why, so I don't actually know. But after this, he's just going into a new analogy about how the genome is like a book, and I think we'll leave that for the rare part 4 to the series. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Furrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostic Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabry Babry, Sphincter of Doom, Vollus, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.